Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're zeroing in on a really crucial, rapid-fire period in history. The year is 1862. The dust is only just starting to settle from the massive 1857 rebellion, and the British government has forcefully taken direct control of India from the East India Company. It's this incredibly fragile, high-stakes moment of reorganization. And right at the center of this storm steps our focus for today, Lord Elgin I. We're going to look specifically at his pivotal 1862 reforms. It was a remarkably short window of time, but it literally laid the concrete for modern bureaucratic governance in the subcontinent.
Okay, let's dive into this explainer. We'll be breaking down his incredibly consequential 20-month tenure into a few key areas. We'll start with his arrival as the new Crown Viceroy, unpack that massive 1862 administrative consolidation, explore how he expanded networks and trade, look at the unexpected 1863 frontier crisis, and wrap up with his lasting legacy.
Before we get into the weeds, I want you to keep this question in the back of your mind. How much can a leader really change a country in just 20 months? Usually you'd think not much, right? But Elgin's brief administration kind of forces us to rethink that timeline. And understanding this matters because the frameworks enacted during this tiny 1862 window didn't just stabilize an empire. They actively shaped the legal and administrative boundaries of the modern Indian state.
So, Section 1, a new Crown Viceroy, bringing some heavy global experience to a post-rebellion India.
To really understand Elgin's approach, we first have to appreciate the intensely high-stakes scene he was walking into. India was right in the middle of transitioning from a corporate monopoly under the East India Company to direct rule by the British Crown. That required a remarkably steady hand. They needed someone who wasn't just learning on the job. And if you look at his background, it's obvious why he got the gig. Governor of Jamaica, Governor General of Canada, where he actually established responsible government, High Commissioner in China. This brilliantly illustrates his deep administrative pedigree. By the time he stepped onto Indian soil in 1862, he was a seasoned, globally tested diplomat who had managed complex colonial transitions across 3 different continents. Now, it's worth noting that his global experience was also marked by some very aggressive imperial enforcement. While serving in China during the Second Opium War, his actions were highly decisive and controversial. He negotiated the Treaty of Tientsin, acquired the Kowloon Peninsula, and, most notably, ordered the absolute destruction of Beijing's old summer palace. I point this out just as factual background context to his problem-solving methods. Elgin was absolutely a pragmatist, but he was also a man who had already proven he would use devastating force to achieve diplomatic goals if he felt it was necessary. Yet, when he actually arrived in India, his personal style was surprisingly restrained. It's a striking contrast. Past governor generals absolutely loved their traditional viceregal pomp, the elaborate parades, the grand theatrical entries. Elgin, he favored a much more pragmatic, business-like approach. In fact, he often opted to just take the train. It might seem like a minor detail, but it perfectly set the tone for what 1862 was going to be about. He wasn't there to play the role of a flamboyant king. He was there to be a bureaucrat and stabilize the realm. Which brings us to Section 2, 1862, Consolidating the Administration, the real blueprint for direct crown rule.
This is really the core of what we're looking at today. In 1862, Elgin's primary job actually wasn't to invent a bunch of new laws from scratch. His mandate was to take the massive legislative frameworks drafted by his predecessor, Lord Canning, and actually put them to work. The structural shift here is huge. The old judicial system was a mess. You had these fragmented Supreme Courts operating right alongside traditional Sadar adalats. Under Elgin, the Indian High Courts Act of 1861 was fully implemented. He tossed out the fragmented system and established unified chartered high courts in Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras. This brilliantly illustrates the modern legacy of his 1862 judicial reforms. He created a unified legal structure that literally still echoes in India's judiciary today.
And he applied that exact same organizing energy to the government itself, mainly by implementing the Indian Councils Act. So what did this actually do? Well, for the first time, non-official Indian members were included in the lawmaking process. It was modest, sure, but a crucial step toward representation. He also decentralized legislative powers, pushing them back to regional hubs like Madras and Bombay. He formalized what's known as the portfolio system, meaning executive members finally had specific, focused departments. He essentially created a modern cabinet. On top of that, he threw his support behind open competitive exams for the imperial civil services. He fundamentally reorganized the administrative workflow to ensure a much more stable and slightly more inclusive form of governance.
And while the government was restructuring, society was moving right along with it. Here's a quick, pretty surprising fact. Right in the middle of these massive bureaucratic reforms in 1862, Calcutta University conferred its very first Master of Arts degree. It's a great little testament to the civil and educational modernization that was happening concurrently under his watch. The mechanisms of a modern state were all coming online at exactly the same time.
Moving to Section 3, expanding networks and trade and integrating the Indian economy.
Okay, so let's look at how this all builds into the physical infrastructure. Because, you can't just pass a law in Calcutta and expect it to magically work in Bombay without a way to connect the two. Under Elgin, infrastructure saw rapid, massive expansion. He greenlit the extension of major lines like the East Indian Railway and the Great Indian Peninsula Railway. He deliberately connected the inland agrarian belts, where all the crops were actually grown, directly out to the major port cities. And he dramatically expanded the telegraph lines. So the crucial point here is this. Railways and telegraphs weren't just handy tools for economic growth. They were the central nervous system of the empire. They were absolutely essential for moving troops quickly and maintaining tight administrative control over a massive geography.
He also leveraged the land itself to boost the economy. The administration streamlined what were called wasteland allotments. Essentially, this incentivized private, mostly European, commercial agriculture. By cutting the bureaucratic red tape, this policy directly sparked a massive boom in commercial tea plantations across Assam, Darjeeling, and the Nilgiri Hills. It was a very calculated economic strategy, designed to deeply integrate the Indian agricultural economy into broader global British trade networks.
Section 4. The 1863 Frontier Crisis. Testing the limits of this new imperial control. Now, Elgin's focused bureaucratic peace in 1862 didn't last forever. By 1863, sudden violence erupted on the northwest frontier, which severely tested the limits of this newly consolidated crown rule. To manage these borders, the British were essentially debating two vastly different strategies. You had the forward policy, which favored aggressive, direct military control and occupation. And on the flip side, you had masterly inactivity, which relied on diplomatic restraint, watchfulness, and indirect influence. Given Elgin's mission to stabilize and consolidate, he leaned heavily toward the cautious, masterly inactivity. He wanted to avoid costly foreign wars at all costs. But as we'll see, his hand was ultimately forced. The conflict on the frontier escalated very rapidly. A group of Wahabi Islamic revivalists, centered around Satana, mounted an armed resistance against British authority. Despite his strong preference for restraint, Elgin looked at the situation, determined the threat was just too great, and authorized the 1863 Ambala campaign. He dispatched troops deep into the rugged tribal frontier belt under the command of Sir Hugh Rose, which led to the forceful dismantling of the Wahabi strongholds. It was a difficult, costly campaign, but it showed that when push came to shove, the administration was entirely willing to pivot from careful bureaucracy to sheer military force to suppress an insurgency. Finally, Section 5. A brief but lasting legacy. The sudden end of the 8th Earl of Elgin. So having stabilized the courts, expanded the railways, and suppressed a frontier rebellion, Elgin's administration seemed totally poised for a long, successful run. But it came to an incredibly abrupt conclusion. Looking at his final months in 1863, he spent the summer governing from the cooler climate of Simla. By autumn, he undertook a grueling physical tour of Upper India to oversee those volatile frontier affairs in person. But the physical toll was just too much. On November 20, 1863, Lord Elgin died unexpectedly of heart disease in Dharamshala. He was buried right there at St. John in the Wilderness Church. His highly effective administration was cut entirely short.
When historians look back at his tenure, they often summarize it with quotes just like this: a period of stability, consolidation, and cautious governance, prioritizing peace after a turbulent decade. Elgin wasn't a flamboyant visionary. He wasn't a radical innovator. But his conservative, pragmatic approach in 1862 successfully laid the heavy, concrete foundations for British Crown rule, a system that would persist for nearly a century. Which leaves us with a final thought to ponder. If a mere 20-month administration can cement the judicial and administrative foundations of modern governance, unifying the courts, organizing the cabinets, laying down the telegraphs and the rails, how much of history is actually shaped by the silent bureaucrats meticulously doing the paperwork rather than the loud conquerors charging into battle? It's absolutely something to think about. Thank you for joining me for this explainer on Lord Elgin I, and keep questioning the history behind the systems we use every day.